She was 14 when the Comanche came, hid in a creek bed with cold water around her ankles, and walked out an orphan. She taught herself to weave, sold blankets on a dirt street, made a life that fit exactly one person. 9 years later, a runaway horse charged toward her stall. One man stepped straight into its path and refused to leave her life. She heard it before she saw it. Not the hoofbeats themselves, but the wrong rhythm underneath them, the broken cadence of an animal past the point of steering. She turned. A gray mare, full run, reins trailing, a splintered hitching post bouncing and cracking off the ruts behind her. The boardwalk on both sides cleared fast, people pressing flat against storefronts, a woman yanking a small boy backward by his collar. The horse had its eyes white and its head high, and it was coming straight down the center of the street with nothing between it and Anna's stall but open ground. A man came off the boardwalk to the left. He didn't chase the horse. He moved into her path at an angle, one arm out, body turned into the coming collision the way you turn into something you have already decided to take. He caught the trailing rein one-handed, absorbed the shoulder check without going down, and started talking, low and even. Nothing she could make out from where she stood. The mare threw her head twice, then the legs slowed. Then she was standing there, blowing hard and shaking, while he kept one hand flat on her neck and went on talking until the shaking stopped too. The whole street had stopped with her. He handed the rein to the livery boy, who came running, looked at the broken post, then looked at the stall, a quick scan, checking damage, not looking for credit, and walked over. He looked at her hands on the crossbar before he looked at her face. "Your stall all right?" She looked down. Her knuckles had gone white without her noticing. She loosened them. "Still standing, thank you." He turned to the blankets on the board and looked at them the way you look at something you are actually considering. He picked up a saddle blanket from the front of the stack and turned it once, thumbs pressing into the weave to feel the density. She told him the wool came from a man 2 towns west, and the dye was fixed with oak gall. Wouldn't bleed in rain or crossing water. He listened without looking up, set it down, picked it back up, bought it. Coin set down clean, 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." He went up the street with his blanket under his arm, unhurried, like a man who had decided long ago that rushing was a thing other people did. She watched him go and went back to straightening the board. His name came to her through the women who passed without stopping, talking freely the way people talk freely in front of things that have always been in a particular place. Jacob Harrison, small spread north of town, rode in with the Dalhart drive and never left with it. That last detail carried the weight of curiosity and judgment both, and she filed it away. He came back the next morning with a reason for a second blanket. Heavier wool for a bedroll, he said, and she took it without comment. Third visit, he needed one for the bunkhouse, which she was fairly certain he didn't have. Fourth visit, his horse had gotten into the first one, which she was certain wasn't true. She folded each one and took the coin and said nothing about any of it. He had taken to arriving with 2 cups of coffee, setting one at the edge of her board without comment, the way you set something down that belongs there. She had taken to drinking it without comment. Neither of them had remarked on it becoming a pattern. One morning she arrived before he did, and set both cups at the edge of the board herself. When he arrived, he looked at the cups, then at her. She was straightening blankets and did not look up. He picked up his cup and said nothing. The town had begun to notice. She felt it in the way conversations thinned when she passed, in the glances that followed her to the end of the street where he'd gone. She kept to her work. On one of those mornings, she asked him why he moved from town to town. It came out more direct than she'd intended, and she kept her hands on the board. He looked at his cup. "I came up from a family spread in Crockett County. Younger son. My older brother had more use for it than I did, so I left him to it and went to find out what else there was. He turned the cup once on the board edge. I've been riding for work mostly. Drove cattle, mended fence, broke horses for a man up in Lubbock for about a year. She waited. I figured I'd know the right place when I found it. He set it to the cup, not to her, which made it land heavier than if he'd looked up. This one's held me longer than most. I can't say I've minded that. She wove at night. It was the only time the room above the feed store was quiet enough to do it properly. No cartwheels on the street below, no voices through the thin walls, just the knock and pull of the loom and the kerosene lamp throwing its amber light across the floor. The loom had been second-hand when she bought it, a widow in Caldwell selling off what she couldn't carry east, and it had taken a month to learn its particular tensions. Now her hands knew it without consultation. She was working the chevron border on a new saddle blanket somewhere in the third week of Jacob Harrison coming to her stall every morning. Rust and cream, double row, each row offset by half a stitch. Her mother had taught her this pattern on summer evenings when the light held late, guiding her small hands through the offset until it became reflex. Her mother had learned it from her own mother before that. The kind of knowledge passed hand to hand down a line of women, each one teaching the next, before there was time to think about what would happen if she didn't. Her mother had been dead for 9 years. The raid came in early October, the year Anna was 14. Comanche moving fast through the river settlements, there and gone before the nearest town could mount a response. Her parents, her 2 younger brothers, the neighbor boy who had stayed over after a birthday supper the night before. She had gone to the creek before first light the way she did most mornings, and she heard it from there, heard it begin and heard it end. And she did not go back. She crouched in the creek bed with the cold water running around her ankles, and she stayed until the silence had been complete long enough to trust. And then she stayed longer still, because she understood with the kind of clarity some moments force on a person that going back was not something she could do and survive. She had been alone since that morning, in the way that means there is no face you reach for in a hard moment, no voice you expect to hear when you open a door. She had built her life around that fact the same way she built everything, practically without sentiment. She worked the border until the lamp needed trimming, trimmed it, kept working. She told herself she wasn't thinking about 2 cups of coffee sitting side by side at the edge of a blanket board. She told herself that for quite some time. It was a Thursday when Mabel Greer came to the stall. Small woman, older, with the stillness of someone who has carried something for long enough that it has become part of how they stand. She wasn't there to buy. Anna could see that from how she arrived. She picked up a blanket from the middle of the stack anyway, turned it over, and her thumb found the border. She went still. The double row chevron in rust and cream, offset by half a stitch on every row. Her thumb moved along it slowly, the way you trace something you recognize but weren't expecting to find. I know this pattern. Anna straightened the front stack. The woman looked up. Her eyes had the careful look of someone giving another person time to prepare for what's coming. Ruth Fletcher made it this way. I knew your mother. We came out to Texas the same year. Our families settled 2 miles apart on the Brazos. She was my closest friend for 4 years before my husband's work took us north. She stopped, looked back at the border under her thumb. I heard what happened to your family, October of '67. I have thought about it ever since, about whether you had come through. A horse stamped at the hitching post across the way. I came through. Anna's voice was level. 9 years had made it level when she needed it to be. I'm glad she had a friend who remembers her." She took the blanket gently from Mabel Greer's hands and refolded it. The woman stood a moment longer with the weight of more to say and the understanding that it wasn't wanted. Then she nodded once and walked back up the street. Anna set the blanket on the stack and smoothed the edge with her palm and left her hand there a beat longer than the smoothing required. Jacob was at the left edge of the stall. He had come at his usual time, and she hadn't heard him. She didn't know how much had reached him. He set a coin on the board, picked up his blanket, left without a word. She went back to work. A man who heard something like that and chose not to press it was either indifferent or he understood that some things belonged to the person carrying them. She already knew which one he was. The knowing settled in her chest, and she left it there without examining it. It was a Friday morning, the stall busy enough that she didn't notice the three women until they were already positioned at the board. Caroline Aldridge she knew by sight, wife of the merchant on the south end of the street, a woman who wore her social standing carefully and at all times. The two with her were familiar from the church steps. None of them were looking at the blankets. The opening was pleasant enough. The work was lovely. Everyone said so. Anna had real skill with her hands. She kept the board between herself and whatever was coming because something was coming. She could feel it in the quality of Mrs. Aldridge's smile, the extra work it was doing. A girl in Anna Fletcher's situation, the name placed with precision, like a thumb finding a bruise, would do better with stable indoor work. A household position, something with standing. Selling goods on a street was fine for a season, but not the foundation a woman built a life on. A woman alone, without family or people to speak for her, needed to consider how she was perceived. Needed to consider, Mrs. Aldridge said, what was appropriate. She left that word out where it could do its work. This was the second time in a week that Anna's aloneness had been named in public. The first time had come from genuine feeling and had cost her something to receive. This was different. Anna's hands were flat on the board. She kept her eyes on Mrs. Aldridge and said nothing. Jacob had come at his usual hour and not left. He stood 3 feet away with his blanket under his arm and listened to the whole of it without moving. He didn't look at Anna during it. He watched Mrs. Aldridge with the full attention of a man extending a courtesy, hearing someone out completely before deciding what the hearing was worth. The silence after had weight. He set his coffee cup down on the board edge and looked at Mrs. Aldridge. "My mother was on her own at 19. My father broke his leg first winter, and she kept the house and brought in what they needed for 2 years until he healed. Sold eggs, took in mending." He stopped a moment. "There isn't a person in this county who'd say a word against her for it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move from where he was standing. Mrs. Aldridge's mouth opened. Whatever she'd prepared for hadn't accounted for this specific quality of stillness. Not anger, not confrontation, just a man with all the time available to him. She gathered her women and went, her exit a degree faster than her entrance, which was the only available satisfaction, and Anna took it. She straightened blankets that didn't need straightening. When she heard the coin set on the board, she looked up. He was watching her with an expression that wasn't asking for anything. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not the look men sometimes wore after doing something they considered generous. Just checking she was all right. She gave him a small nod. He picked up his blanket and went. She stood in the thin November sun until the street had settled back to its ordinary business. It took longer than she would have liked. The frost came on a Sunday night without warning. She woke to cold seeping through the floorboards and lay still, running the numbers. The dye pots and raw wool were in the lean-to behind the feed store. gaps in the siding she'd stuffed with rags last winter and not yet gotten to this year. If the pots froze, they'd crack. 2 weeks of mordant work and oak gall collection gone. She couldn't absorb that loss. She dressed and went down. He was already in the lean-to. Lantern going, dye pots being moved to the interior wall, breath showing white in the cold. He had tar paper under one arm and was working with the focused economy he brought to everything. No wasted motion, no announcement of himself. She stood in the doorway long enough to understand he wasn't going to explain how he'd known. Then she picked up the loose end of the tar paper and they got to work. The lean-to was small. One lantern between two people meant close quarters, passing things hand to hand, learning where the other person was without looking directly. He held the tar paper flat against the siding while she drove nails. She held the lantern while he restacked the wool. When the rags in the wall gaps needed replacing, he tore strips from a cloth he'd brought and fed them to her one at a time, and she packed them in while he held the light at the angle she needed. The cold sat in everything, and the work pushed it back. When the last pot was stacked and the siding sealed, he straightened, and she became aware, without wanting to, that he hadn't moved to the other side of the lean-to. They had finished the work some time ago. She finished rolling the tar paper. He didn't speak. She turned around. His face in the lantern light was open in a way she hadn't seen it before. Not soft. Jacob Harrison did not do soft. But unguarded. All the steadiness still there, same as always. Except now it had somewhere to go. And they both knew where. The cold moved between them. Down the street a horse shifted in a pen. She set the tar paper on the shelf, picked up a dye pot and moved it 2 inches for no reason her hands could justify. "I have coffee upstairs." He looked at her, then at the door. "I won't say no to that." They sat at her small table while the town came awake below them. Boots on the street, a cart, voices starting up. He drank his coffee black. She told him about the dye process, the oak gall, the mordant, the particular red she'd been chasing for 3 months that kept pulling orange in the final rinse. He asked questions that told her he'd been retaining things she'd said weeks ago in passing, storing them without making a show of it. The morning light came through the single window and sat on the table between them, and neither of them moved to end it. When he finally rose, he picked up his hat from the table and held it a moment, looking at her. Then he put it on and went down the stairs. The room had the quality of a space that has recently held more than it usually does. She had not noticed until now how accustomed she had grown to it, holding only one. He showed up Saturday morning while she was re-stringing the crossbar on the stall. The bracket on the left had been working loose all week, letting the bar cant forward under the weight of the heavier blankets. She had the bracket off and the bar down, and her tools spread across the board when he appeared at the edge of the canvas with no stated purpose. She handed him the bar without looking up. He took it, found the right height without being told, and held it there, steady, while she worked the new screws in. She tested the angle, handed him the end of the cord, and he fed it back through the bracket eye while she ran it around the bar and tied it off. 10 minutes, start to finish. Neither of them said much during it, not because there was anything strained between them, but because there wasn't. The silence had the texture of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill it, which was its own kind of information, and they both received it without remark. When the bar was back up and the blankets rehung, he looked at the repair, then at her. "Holds up better now." "It does." He put his hat on and went. She gathered her tools and stood for a moment looking at the crossbar. Blankets sitting even across it, morning light catching the colors at the far end the way it always did. She did not examine what the morning had been. She thought about it the entire rest of the day. He came around the table and stopped in front of her. She would have had to move deliberately to create more distance. She stayed where she was. "I'd like you to stay on here, as my wife." The stove ticked. One of the horses shifted in the pen outside, slow hooves on cold ground. The coffee smell sat in the warm air, and the morning light lay still across the floor. She thought about a man stepping off a boardwalk into the path of a runaway horse and calling it nothing, showing up in the dark before a frost without being asked. She thought about a creek bed in October, and cold water around the ankles of a 14-year-old girl who had understood that the life she'd had until that morning was gone, and who had stood up out of that water anyway and walked forward because there was no other direction available. She had been walking forward in the only way she knew how ever since, carefully, without excess, not reaching for things she couldn't count on. She reached out and took his hand from where it hung at his side, turned it over, looked at it, the calluses across the palm, the chapped knuckles, the steadiness of it even now. She looked up. Yes. The breath went out of him slow and long. His hand closed around hers and held. She did not tell him about the blanket she was making. She worked it in the late evenings after the stall was packed and the room had gone quiet. The chevron border in rust and cream, the same pattern she put into everything. Her hands moved through it the way they moved through all the work, without needing to be told. What was different was the feeling underneath. Somewhere in the third evening she set the shuttle down and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at what she was making and understood that she was not afraid of it. She had expected to be. Then she picked the shuttle back up and kept going. They married on a Thursday in November, the church cold enough that breath showed in the pews. The town came. Anna walked the aisle in a good wool dress, and Jacob at the front watched her come the whole way, not the door, not the preacher, her, with an expression that had finally stopped holding anything in reserve. Afterward, outside in the cold, Carolyn Aldridge appeared with her practiced warmth. Said, "How lovely." Said, "What a change this must be." Anna looked at her steadily. "I'll keep the stall, Mrs. Aldridge. Good work doesn't stop being good work, because your circumstances change." She took Jacob's arm, and they walked to the wagon. He helped her up and climbed after, and they went north out of town, the flat land opening out on both sides, cold air coming clean off the fields. The smoke from their chimney was already visible ahead, rising straight into the gray November sky. In the wagon bed behind them, folded and tied with cord, was the blanket. Rust and cream chevron border, double row, each row offset by half a stitch. The same one her mother's hands had made. The same one her mother's mother had made before that, carried forward the only way such things survive, through the hands of people who refused to let them disappear. The road went on ahead, and the town fell back, and the morning held them both, plain and sufficient, moving forward the way mornings do,